Riveting music.
Yeah.
Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And now I'd like to introduce your host, Mr. Bob Grace of Sustainable Energy Advantage, Principal Investigator of the NEWEEP project. Sir, you may begin.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome to our 6th webinar for the NEWEEP project, the New England Wind Energy Education Project. Today's webinar is on the topic of wind power as a neighbor. We'll be talking about our experience with the techniques that are available for mitigating public impacts. We have a large crowd registered for today. We've had over 500 registries, many of which are just coming into the webinar now. And so let's move forward. I'm going to start with just a very brief overview of the NEWEEP project. Many of you have participated in our past webinars and conference. But basically, NEWEEP is a project that is designed to accomplish a couple of things: to provide siting decision makers and the potentially impacted public with as objective information as possible on which to make informed decisions about proposed new wind projects throughout the New England region. And the focus to accomplish this is by collecting and disseminating information that's accurate, objective, and up to date on the critical issues that are impacting the public acceptance, the market acceptance of wind projects that are proposed throughout the region. And hopefully by doing so, this process can be part of a broader need to enhance the region's public acceptance of wind energy generation where appropriately cited. Why is NEWEEP important? Well, as most of you are probably aware, wind turbine siting in New England is a very complicated process. With any infrastructure, change is always perceived as threatening, and the public objectives that are behind wind power and which wind power impacts can often conflict. And again, as many of you are aware, this can lead to heated debates. The best decisions can come from having decision makers have access to accurate information and accurate understanding of the issues, as well as the people that are in communities which will be impacted. There is a lot of information available in those communities that conflicts, coming from both project sponsors and opponents, often drowning out the voices of those who are simply looking for facts to make good decisions. A lot of that information has both valid and baseless concerns that are commonly voiced, and so part of our objective here is to highlight what's known about those that are valid and provide as much information in which to address how to address those concerns. There's also a lack of enough independent data, scientific peer-reviewed data. We're trying to bring to the fore what data is available and highlight where more data is needed, and hopefully get away from what we're seeing as a trend of decisions being increasingly made based on fear and hyperbole rather than good data and facts. And hopefully we're also part of a process of turning down the volume. There's a lot of emotion, and that tends to crowd out the opportunities for decision makers to consider the facts. So the bottom line for the NEWEEP project has been good information leads to good decisions, and we try to help bring some of that good information to the forefront. The philosophy of NEWEEP is one of objectivity. Obviously, objectivity is in the eyes of the beholder, but basically the project has been framed as one in which it's acknowledged that wind energy has benefits, but not every place is the right place for wind. And the framing principles are that the consequences of wind power are rarely as dire as made out by organized opponents, and they're often not as free of consequences as the proponents would hope and would sometimes represent. So all of the individuals involved with planning and executing the NEWEEP project have approached this activity from the perspective of what if there was a project that was proposed in our community? If we were in your shoes, what would we want to know? So with that as background, the NEWEEP project has been a 2-year DOE-funded project, Department of Energy funded project that is wrapping up now. It's concluding with this webinar. It's been run by Sustainable Energy Advantage, NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, and a steering committee. We have conducted 6 webinars, this being the last of them, as well as a full-day conference this past June. Information from the past webinars and the conference is available online on the New England Wind Forum website. The link is presented here. And the material from this webinar will be posted by approximately December 21st. So far, NUEEP has accomplished a lot. Between the webinars and the conference, we've had over 2,500 registrants participate. There are definitely some double counting in there, but gives you a sense of the scale of the participation. And based on post-webinar surveys, we have understood that most participants have felt that the information provided was fairly unbiased, and that's really coming from on a 1 to 5 scale, either people that felt that the information was neutral or slightly biased towards wind, slightly biased away from wind. Over 70% of the conference attendees left with feeling much better informed than when they went in. The project has advanced the dialogue and filled a need and provided fair information to allow people to make better decisions. And so we want to thank Department of Energy's Wind and Water Power Program and the Golden, Colorado Field Office for the funding. And after our speakers today, we'll talk just a little bit about what comes next with NUEEP. So from there, let's tee up our speakers. Today's webinar is on Wind Power as a Neighbor, Experience with Techniques for Mitigating Public Impacts. Our speakers and the order in which they will speak are Charles Newcomb from the Wind Technology Deployment Supervisor at National Renewable Energy Labs. He'll be talking about wind energy managing project impacts. Then John Knab, the Town Supervisor from Sheldon, New York, will talk about his experiences of project discussion, the High Sheldon Wind Farm mitigation efforts and lessons learned. And then Nils Bolgen, the Program Director from Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, will talk about examples of mitigation steps taken by wind project sponsors. So just to give an overview here, Mr. Newcomb will introduce a lot of the tools and issues associated with impacts and their mitigation. Mr. Knab will talk from the perspective of a large wind farm and as one of the individuals who had to make decisions and be part of the decision on whether to allow and how to mitigate impacts of that large wind farm. And then Mr. Bolgen will be focusing for the most part on community scale projects. So at this point, we're going to turn control. Actually, before we do, I did want to tee up one more thing. At the end of the webinar, we will be welcoming questions for the panelists. Now, we understand that there are a lot of people that are very passionate about the subject matter, but it's very important to us to encourage a respectful dialogue, and as such, and in order to not allow individuals to monopolize our scarce time. Again, we have several hundred participants here. We want to get to all of the questions. So the way we deal with questions is as follows. On your webinar interface, participants may pose questions, hopefully succinct questions in writing using the webinar's Q&A chat box. Up at the top you should see a choice that says Q&A. To ask a question, you need to click that Q&A. When you're asking the question, typing the question, we would appreciate if you would identify yourself at the beginning of the question. So just your name, the organization, or feel free to say member of the public, and your state. It's okay if you wish to remain anonymous, but it would be helpful if you could at least provide your first name and your state so you know when your question is being asked. And then this is very important, make sure you click Ask afterwards. If you don't click Ask, it doesn't show up on our screen and we don't get to see it. Please, if you could limit yourself to one question each. There are hundreds of participants registered, and we want to try to get everybody's questions. At the end of the session, the questions will be posed. They'll be read by myself in the order asked until we run out of questions or time, whichever comes first. We're not going to screen or prioritize the questions. We're going to try to get to them all. We may skip questions if we feel that they've already been asked and answered. So I'll come back to this, and we'll have these instructions up on the site when it's time for Q&A. But if you have questions that you think of as we go, then you can be entering them as we go, and they'll be among the first to be read. So From there, we'll turn over control to Mr. Charles Newcomb from National Renewable Energy Lab. Charles has 15 years in the wind industry in which he's conducted wind technical evaluations, applications testing, performance testing. He served as an engineering and technical resource for a number of federal agencies and led a technical team in developing the technical regulations for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's renewable energy programs. He's worked as a managing director of operations, as a chief technology officer at different wind manufacturing development companies, where he's managed project origination, equipment procurement, project development, and fleet management. Today, Charles supports the DOE's Wind Powering America deployment program, focusing on regional agricultural and economic development impact, outreach, and wind for schools. So, Charles, we're going to turn over to you, and all yours.
Thank you, Bob. Greetings, everyone. So launching straight in, I wanted to put a word out for the Department of Energy. And to that regard, one of the questions would be, what's the Department of Energy's role with renewable energy? And if you look through the Department of Energy's mission statement, there's a few statements in there. But the one that's relevant to today's conversation is the mission to advance the national economic and energy security of the United States. So that's looking at energy diversity, trying to figure out how do we expand beyond traditional fuels and methodologies, and that includes wind energy. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory's roles as one of the Department of Energy's research labs focused on renewable energy. Our role here is to discover and quantify and share what we learn about renewable energy. So sometimes that's research, and that's we can either be doing it directly or we can be sponsoring it through universities or other partnerships. And that can be in basic sciences, it can be in jobs and economic development impacts, it can be in policy implications. We can do testing here where we're looking at performance or acoustic emissions from wind turbines. And again, it's this, we have a pretty strong analytical group that looks at the jobs and economic development impacts of wind, which is a pretty important decision variable when you're looking at bringing wind into your region, because obviously the play from the local and regional and state perspective is what's in it for us, and not just energy security, but what's in it from the revenue perspective. And then finally, we also do a fair amount of research, both direct and sponsoring in collaboration with other laboratories about how do you put this equipment in, where do you put it in, what does it look like, and how do people perceive it, and how do the grids perceive it. So whenever you're thinking about those kinds of issues about how are people going to look at something, how are people going to approach something, there's always a balance. There's a push-pull, as with so many things. And so on one hand, you've got as an engineer, I tend to bound the equation, and that's kind of what happens when you're an engineer. So, in one perspective is if you let the impacts drive everything, and you say, well, we're going to make an airplane that can't fall out of the sky, it's going to be so heavy that it won't fly, or if it's perfectly safe. On the other hand, if you ignore the impacts, then it ends up as a real problem because you have so much pushback later on that your industry falls flat. So you got to kind of work in those margins a little bit of saying, okay, so how do we balance the notion of we're looking for, excuse me, a more diverse energy blend, but we're trying to minimize our impacts, recognizing that each thing we do to minimize our impact has a cost associated with that. So we kind of have this mitigation budget that we can work within. And when we get too far into that budget, then the project doesn't work anymore. And certain places, as Bob mentioned, are agreeably absolutely not appropriate for wind energy. So you wouldn't put a wind turbine in the Grand Canyon, for example. Not that it would work down there, but that's a specific place that's been carved out because of its natural beauty. When you have areas like that, there's a very compelling argument not to promote development in those kinds of areas. So again, it's our goal. And NUEEP's goal is to find and express this workable balance where the benefits of the technology, of the investment in the technology, and the construction of these wind farms or projects is balanced with minimizing or avoiding impacts where possible. So thinking about this a little bit, when I'm imagining there's a lot of novel voices on the phone today who are thinking, well, what is the impact and why do these things have impact? Some people will be very familiar with it, some people will be less familiar. So please bear with me while I bring everyone up to speed. There's a few fundamental elements about wind projects, and first of all is that they're out there to make power. They're not out there as statues. They're not out there as ornaments to the future. They actually are substantial capital investments, tens of millions of dollars, billions and billions of money spent every year in this industry. So it's a real investment, and thus it has real revenue streams. It has income that comes off it for the investors as well as for the locales where these projects go in, either in terms of direct tax revenue or in payments in lieu of taxes or other methods. They are in prominent places. They require real estate. They actually are physical objects that need a place to sit, to be plugged into the grid and to not tip over. So they need a nice wide base. So they need a certain amount of real estate, and they need associated infrastructure. So they need roads. Sometimes they need buildings to house things. Sometimes they need laydown areas to put the equipment while it's being built or for operations and maintenance. And they convert this wind energy that's abundant and flows across our environment, and they convert that into electrical energy. And that means that something has to move. The wind is moving, so there has to be some component that interacts with that moving wind, and there has to be something that converts that kinetic energy into electrical energy. So since it's moving, it's not static. It is dynamic, and it has moving parts. It's a machine. It's a large machine that's sometimes hundreds of feet tall. So when you think about it from that perspective, the general categories of the impacts can be put into two bins. There's this visual one where you've got a large object that's prominent, and the anecdote I often use is there's a road on my way to work, and back in the old days, not that long ago, before we had our utility scale machines, we had some small 600 kilowatt wind turbines that were only I think about 50 meters to the hub or so, with short blades, but I could see them from 20 miles away if they were running. If they weren't running, I couldn't see them against the backdrop of the mountains. But as soon as they were running, my eye would focus on that motion, and I could see them from 20-some miles away. So our eyes are very perceptive, and then audible, and that is not a Furby or anything else. That is actually a microphone on a standard dimensioned test platform at a specific orientation for measuring the acoustic emissions of wind turbines themselves. So those are the two general categories. I want to focus first on the visual impacts. And again, recognizing that these are tall machines, most of the utility scale machines are leaving the 80-meter tower behind and moving into the 100-meter tower, and that's tall. And the rotor diameters, 5 years ago, the standard rotor diameter might be between 80 and 90 meters or so, and now it's moving above 100-meter rotor. So these are, coming up on 328 feet or so to the hub, and upwards of 450 feet to the tip of the blade. So they're visible from great distances. And as such, they also cast a shadow. And you can see in this image that these shadows can be long. They can also be short. In the noon on a summer day, they can be very short and just oscillate around the tower. But around the spring and late fall and early spring, the shadows can get quite long and can cast a shadow that moves on people's property. Good thing is that we generally know where the sun is going to come up, and we can actually calculate with great precision where the turbine shadow is likely to fall in a certain area. This is a shadow map on the right-hand side that sort of shows, based on these various colors, how many minutes or hours that shadow is going to be in a certain place in space. And it doesn't generally stray from this. And then you get into the debate about, well, what's the right amount of time for you to be able to flicker on somebody? And sometimes it's 0, and sometimes it's 50 hours. It depends on who the resident is and what the local guidelines are, and whether the person who has the shadow flickering on their house is involved with the project. So a farmer who has that turbine on their property may be quite happy to have a shadow flicker, because every revolution, every shadow passing is another few cents, and it's a constant reminder that they're getting something for it. So the mitigation for the shadow is proper siting. Because we know where these shadows are going to land, we can predict them. We can then put these projects or the turbines and site them specifically to avoid flickering on someone's home. The other one is curtailment. So, in fact, if we need to get or we'd like to get close enough to a house where it's going to flicker, but we have other drivers to be there, there's the option to turn it off while that shadow happens to be right on that person's property or on their house. And I just put a number out there, which is 50 hours a year, which would be a lot. Out of 8760 hours is a fraction of a percent. So it's something that if there's one house that you're worried about, you can imagine that it wouldn't be a real problem to turn that turbine off for a few hours a year. If there's lots of houses around you and you're turning it off for larger fractions, perhaps it's not the right place to put a turbine anyway. The other one is, I mentioned when the farmer is owning a project, that's good. But the other way to do it is just to bring people into the fold and allow them to benefit from the project directly, monetarily. And that's coming in the form of a neighbor payment or some other compensation to acknowledge the fact that you do have a direct impact on them and that there's a trade-off in there somewhere. So in terms of the machinery and the moving parts of the wind turbine, there's a lot of components to the wind turbine, and this cartoon here hardly does justice to it, but it does highlight where the principal sources of sound emission come from. And they can be broken into this whole, the bullets on the left are all the bits and pieces in broad groups that are within we call it the nacelle, Greek for boat, which houses everything up top, the whole power assembly up top. And that's where the principal noises are coming from the machine side. And then there's the aerodynamic perspective. There are some cooling fans that can be down at the bottom of the tower, but those are effectively inaudible. However, when you look at the system as a whole, because these emitting elements are so high in the air, 300 feet in the air, their actual contribution to the sound is relatively small, and a big contribution to the sound is coming from the aerodynamic noise from the blade itself. And so that's where a lot of the most recent research has come from. That said, there are some things that when we look at a wind turbine, we don't even think about the fact that why is it designed that way? Why does it have 3 blades, not 5 or 2 or 1? And these various elements here are actually all about sound, not all about sound, but the first 2 are about sound. And so the question of upwind versus downwind, turbines are upwind, not because it's better, faster, cheaper, but because it's quieter. When the blade is downwind of a tower, there's this little wind tower shadow, and as the blade passes through that shadow, there's an audible thump, and that was kind of a problem with the early machines that they mitigated to a degree by using sort of spiral figures on towers, that they used lattice towers and other elements to try to mitigate that, but eventually they just turned the unit so the rotor was on the upwind side of the tower. Similarly, 2 versus 3 blades. In fact, 2 blades is a little cheaper than 3 blades, but you have to spin the rotor a little faster to get the same amount of energy out of it. That means a higher tip speed ratio. That means the higher transport of the tip through the air, and that's a little bit louder. So people have gone to 3 blades because it's quieter. It also just so happens that it tends to be an more even look to the eye because it doesn't appear to appear and disappear as a 2-bladed rotor can. But really, it's a sound issue that drove that design choice. And then finally, the tubular tower, as we mentioned, that's an aesthetic choice. People have commented that large lattice towers look pretty industrial, and they'll tolerate them for legacy transmission towers, but they're less happy about them for new transmission towers. So you'll notice that a lot of the new transmission towers are actually tubular when they're around people, and that's also driven our wind industry. And then the color of the paint. So that's a visual thing again, where white's nice, and actually it's not bright white. It's sort of a little bit of a gray white so that it doesn't stand out quite so brightly. You'll actually notice some towers, and I think Enercon is most famous for this, where the bottom of the tower has these kind of shades of green that go up about 40 or 50 feet. And why would you do that? Well, when you see them from a distance against a distant tree line, you can't actually see the bottom of the tower against the trees. And there are those little measures that folks have done to get things going like that. And then in terms of mechanical sound mitigation, these are interesting approaches that have been taken over the years that most folks don't even think about, but there's been a lot of effort put into how do we make these things quieter, because originally, as you probably are well aware, a lot of this development happened in Europe near people first. And near was like within hundreds of feet of a home, not thousands of feet. And so there was a lot of effort put into making these things quieter. The first one was trying to figure out how to actually get the gearbox to be quieter, because the spur cut gears, which is in the bottom here of the two gears, let me just highlight them real quickly. This is a spur cut gear here versus the helical gear. Well, the spur cut might be less expensive, certainly for smaller gear elements, but it's louder. And the way to remember this is that, you put your, it doesn't work so well with automatics, but it does a little bit. Put your car in reverse, you're using a spur cut gear versus helical if you're in forward gear. And you know exactly how much that machine whines when it's in reverse compared to going forward, and that's because you've got more teeth sharing the load in a helical situation. So there happens to be a fringe benefit with helical in that the gearboxes last longer, but they're also quieter. We've also got these various isolators here, and this is a cartoon of a vibration isolator. And these we see all over the world, but we use them for attaching all the moving mechanical pieces to the bed plate and the other wind turbine components. And it's very effective at keeping the propagation of the vibration from entering the tower and acting as a large resonator. And we do that for the generator itself. That's on isolators. We do it for all the pumps and all the fans and other elements that are spinning. And that has led to a pretty reasonable diminishment in acoustic emissions from the turbine itself. We're using variable speed on cooling systems. We're using these foam pads on the inside of the nacelles to drop a few decibels off. In certain conditions, I was definitely involved in projects where we were having systems that would make noise even when the wind wasn't blowing. And so we figured out that if we had these things make a little bit of noise at the top of the hour as opposed to all the time, that didn't bother people quite so much. It ended up as kind of a neighbor Westminster Abbey, if you will. And then appropriate maintenance. So there are certain elements of wind turbine that will make more noise when it's not properly maintained. So, but there's only so much you can do to reduce the noise from a wind turbine directly. You can't make it silent because it's a large kinetic machine. So one of the tricks then is to keep from upsetting the neighbors is to site it properly. And so we're looking to put these turbines sort of in where you get these diminishing returns. So once you get out a few hundred meters, then you're to where the sound level is pretty low and tractable. So especially in comparison to background noise emissions, and most of you have probably seen these figures that other sources of sound emissions are, and we try to get it down to around the sound of a refrigerator is heard from another room. So sighting is really important, and sometimes you can't sight it where you want to, and sometimes you can. So here's a picture of the Pete's Wind Farm up in northeastern Colorado, and you can see that there would be a direct line that would be drawn between this turbine here in the northeast and this turbine here, sort of in the center picture. But that line is crooked because this turbine here is a little bit further away from the house to make sure that we weren't impacting that house. So that's a nice graphical example of trying to push the turbine to some other location. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that there's these acoustic emissions from the blade itself, and just so happens that the noise emissions, the sound emissions from the blade goes with a fifth power of the tip speed, the speed of the blade through the air. So by making a small change, like even a 15% change in the tip speed by lowering the rotational speed, which generally means making the blades longer, you can make the turbine a little bit quieter. So 15% drop in rotor speed ends up about halving the sound emission from that turbine. That's pretty good. It does come at a cost because now you have higher torque, because power is torque times speed. Lower the speed, increase the torque, and you don't get it for free. So people are doing that, and they also have low speed modes, so when there's specific meteorological conditions where sound will propagate unusually far, there are manufacturers that will run the turbine at a lower tip speed at a certain production loss. In contrast to that, there are these trailing edge improvements here, and they've looked at various ones. They've looked at putting porosity at this trailing edge on the blade itself. They looked at adding porosity to the tip or to the leading edge. They've added brushes to the backs of the blades, and what seems to be the current favorite is the serration at the back of a blade. Oh, I wonder if I lost my internet connection. We'll see. So these trailing iterations are actually dropping the noise emissions from the blade itself by 3 decibels. Well, that just happens to be a halving in sound. So if you compare the difference of adding serrations as opposed to changing the entire machine design, you can see which one would probably be preferred. So that's a big one. And I mentioned also sometimes there's conditions where the sound propagates unusually far, and there's also the condition, the human condition, that we are incredibly perceptive animals, perhaps not as good as some other animals out there, but we can hear things a long way away. And the interesting thing is a lot of it has to do with our attention. So if we're having a conversation with somebody, we will miss somebody calling our name a few feet away. But if you walk into a restaurant and you're trying to find a friend, somebody only has to barely whisper your name and you can hear them and find them. So a lot of that has to do with how you're feeling about the situation. So when you're not connected to the project, you tend to be less interested in listening to it or seeing it. And that's called the checkerboard effect, where you'll get one farmer who's quite happy with the wind farm and may be closer to a turbine than the next farmer, and yet the more distant farmer is less happy about the nearby wind turbine, and that has a lot to do with being connected. And so that ties back to these interesting and innovative ownership models. Rick Vanderveen in Michigan, has been pushing this model pretty well to good effect, where you end up coming up with a revenue distribution plan that is independent to a degree of actually having wind turbine on your land or not, so that everybody can benefit from the project to a degree. And we're seeing this in the Northeast more in the form of neighbor payments. So those things are, those creative solutions are really important to investigate when you can and when needed. So again, when we think about the siting strategies, the first step that most developers will take, these are the trends that we've observed, is that they'll first look to follow the rule of the law. If in following the rule of the law and doing everything right, they still have unhappy neighbors, they'll consider payments in lieu of taxes to the neighborhood, to the town in general. They'll also look at these creative ownership models that I mentioned are being played out in Michigan and Wisconsin and other places. And then following that, they'll move on to neighbor payments to acknowledge that there's different levels of impact depending on your proximity to the wind turbine. And again, that engages a neighbor, makes them feel like they're part of the project, and it lowers the annoyance level, which I think is an important thing. Curtailment is kind of the last ditch. If you can't make it work other ways, then you curtail, but you're losing revenue. And the minute you start losing revenue, it's not in anyone's best interest, really. So there are some other impacts to just briefly glance across in my last 40 seconds or so, is that construction is another thing. It's not just the operation of the equipment, it's the installation of the equipment. You have a typical crane can involve as many 20 to 25 semi-loads worth of gear to come in, and plus another crane to lift that crane, and sometimes that lifting crane, that auxiliary crane, can take a few truckloads of its own. So there's a lot of that. There's hundreds of truckloads of cement that are going to come in, and there's roads that need to be built, and there's fugitive dust, and there's noise, and there's hours of construction, and all that kind of stuff that can be a problem. But the way to mitigate it and to handle it is to make it clear, well, here are the benefits. Again, let's all get on the same page with regard to the benefits. And then let's make sure you know what's coming up. Next Sunday, this road is going to be closed, or but this over here is going to have ice cream on it, or whatever it is. There's going to be some way to compensate for the disruption in your normal life. So a lot of it is good communication, and the better developers out there are really quite top-notch at communicating with the neighborhood about what they need to do to get the project in. The industry is maturing pretty well on many regards, and on one of them is that I don't know if you've been watching the front page on about fracking and land leases and how unhappy some property owners are. And we've moved well beyond that. We're really far beyond when developers were kind of shooting from the hip. And now they're pretty sophisticated, and they know that this is a long-term play. We're about, only a fraction into the investment that we need to make into wind energy over the next several decades, and they need to play it from a sustainable perspective. So they've gotten quite good at managing expectations. There are, of course, wildlife impacts. It's not the topic of conversation, but I didn't want to ignore them completely. And condition-based curtailment is definitely up front. A couple thoughts, and condition-based curtailment mainly says that, listen, we don't have to turn the turbines off if the winds are blowing 40 miles an hour because bats aren't flying at 40 miles an hour, that kind of thing, as opposed to, well, it's bat season, let's turn the turbine off all the time. So those kinds of creative curtailment methods are definitely in play for turbines and projects where there are wildlife concerns, and folks would rather do that than turn them off wholesale. A couple, as the last slide, a couple observations. Public benefit correlates well with project approval. That's absolutely true. So the degree to which the public feels engaged, feels like they benefit, they recognize the benefits, there are benefits to them, that's going to certainly get them to rally around a project better. Most of the projects I was involved with were public projects, and we had zero pushback on any of our projects because we were very good about communicating, and we made sure that we put the projects into the water treatment plant or the school or community college or whatever it was to make it work. And of course, in homage to NEWEEP, NREL, and DOE, is the notion that this credible, clear, sort of honest broker information is vital to the conversation, making sure that, as Bob mentioned earlier, that the conversation is rational, that it's centered on scientific basis as opposed to here's what we're really worried about. And you'll see this in the property values graphs that Ben Hohen will show in some of his analysis about what happens with property values after a project is announced before it even goes in. Sometimes you'll see a depression of property values because people don't know what to expect. But as soon as the project's in and running, everybody goes, oh, this isn't at all what we thought it was going to be. This is totally fine, and project values completely recover. So those kinds of things, those anecdotes are out there to show that, yeah, a lot of this has to do with getting the right information out there, making sure that people have credible, real information. And again, just as a reminder that as we think about mitigation, we think about minimizing our impact on the environment and the public around us, it does come at a cost, and that it's not a limitless mitigation budget, that at some point the project won't come through. And so if your job as a county administrator or whatever is to bring projects in and economic development, that you're paying attention to that, so you know that the developer does not have an infinite pool of mitigation strategies or budgets. So Bob, I think that was my last slide. I hope I wasn't too far over.
Thank you, Charles. We're going to save questions for the end, but if you have questions, please feel free to answer them or to post them on the Q&A board now. Our next speaker is John Knab. John, is your voice on? Can we hear you?
Yes. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Let me just do an introduction, and we'll get you going here. John has been the town of Sheldon supervisor since 2000. He's been elected 7 times, most recently last month. Prior to that, he served as a town councilman for 14 years and a town judge for 16 years. For most of his career, though, he worked as a correctional officer at the Attica Prison, which is 10 miles away from the town center. John's lived in the same house for 73 years. As the father of 6 kids and soon to be 9 grandkids. So John's a lot like many of the folks that are online here now that are participating. He's not a wind expert, but he had to become one when a developer came to town. So, John, please let us hear about your experiences.
Okay. As you just said, I've been elected 7 times as town supervisor. 3 of them was during the wind project. I had anti-windmill people running against me. I won all 3 of those elections with a pretty good margin. Town of Sheldon is a rural ag community. We have approximately 2,550 residents in the town and about twice as many dairy cows. It's a dairy community, dairy farming. We have a right to farm law in place that protects the farmers so they can keep farming on the smell and different things that bother people moving out from the city. We don't have an abundance of water. We don't have cheap electricity. And, with the farming profits dropping off here for a few years, the windmills have been a real asset to the town. Major employers here in the county or our areas, county governments. We have a local county-owned hospital, 2 state correctional facilities, Presto Light electric Incorporated and Pioneer Recovery. Plus, there's three different school districts come into our town. So there's people who work at the schools also. High Sheldon Wind Farm is a 112.5 megawatt, 75 turbine facility. Began operation in March of 2009. Broke ground July 21st of 2008. We had real good weather during the construction period. Everything went good. The roads was hard and dry. The Invenergy, the developer, had real good contractors. They seemed to work good with the landowners and, kept everybody advised of what was going on, which is the main thing to do. Because you can move on to the next slide now. We were approached for the first time in 2001 by a developer that wanted to site some test towers in our town. We didn't have any law in effect at the time or zoning to regulate these, so we town board and the planning board, we worked together. We got a local law in place, got it passed, had public hearings and everything, and it went through. And the first test tower went up in October of 2001. So we kind of thought as long as we got, people were interested in siting test towers, that we should get working on a local law to regulate the siting of windmills. So we started on that in late 2001. We adopted the local law in January of 2003. And then we had three different developers approach us. The first one was a company from Spain. Didn't seem to have an awful lot of backing, and they couldn't negotiate contracts with the landowners or leases. The second one, I think, had some personnel problems. They just didn't seem to hit it off with the landowners. And then Invenergy is a Chicago-based firm, their own, United States-owned company. They've started in. They first were building gas-powered turbines, and then they branched out into wind turbines. And I think at the present time they have around 20 wind farms up and running. Our turbines are all 700, or our local law was that they had to be set back 750 feet from roads or property lines, a sound limit of 50 decibels or less at the property line. And one of the things we put in our law that we're real happy with is that all power lines had to be buried at least 42 inches below the surface of the ground. They could not dig up or disturb any creeks or streams. And anytime they wanted to cross a road, they had to bore underneath it, not dig up the road, because there's always a bump or a dip in the road once you never get it compacted back to the same level as the road was before. So we made them bore underneath all the roads also. It was a long process from when we were first approached in 2003 by Invenergy. We didn't at the time, the town did not have an engineering firm in place. We interviewed a number of engineering firms, and a lot of them hadn't had any experience with wind projects. We settled on Stantec Corporation out of Rochester, New York. Their home office is in Guelph, Ontario. They'd had worked with wind projects in the Ontario province. As soon as we had the engineering firm contracted with, we started working on the seeker, which we thought was only going to take maybe 8-9 months, but it took 1 or 2 years to get it, because all the permitting and everything had to be done in different agencies. And finally, in April of 2007, they presented everything to the town board. The wind developer reduced her from 86 turbines to 75 turbines. Each turbine is 396 foot to the tip of the blade. And they, at the time, had, all the landowners signed up, pretty much ready to go. We had a public hearing on it, and there was opposition, and they were real vocal. We'd been taken to court 5 times. The first time was some conflict of interest because which they said was brother-in-law, was getting some turbines on his property. He owns 1,600 acres in our town. Their main farm is not in our town, but they farm quite a bit of portion of their land in our town. Judge ruled in the town's favor, because my wife and his wife are sisters, so we're not really blood brother-in-laws. Then we sued for sound, that there was going to be excessive sound, and we won that one. We sued for shadow flicker and visual disruption, and that was, the judge ruled in our favor on that. We were sued for killing of migrating birds, and the judge ruled in our favor on that. Then they took an appeal, all the cases, and went to Rochester to the Court of Appeals, and the judges ruled there in our favor. That reason not to stop the project. So the town board approved it in April of 2007, and the wind company had to get all the permits in place. Had to have a public hearing with the Public Service Commission, New York State, and then DEC permits, which took a real long time. Army Corps of Engineers, because they were crossing a couple creeks, they had to go through them, and oil and water, they diversion ditches and tile lines and everything. They had to make sure they didn't disrupt any of them. They broke ground in July 21st of 2008. As I said before, in our area, it was a dry, hot summer. The roads held up real good. Negotiated when we done the post agreement. We negotiated also a road agreement that roads had to be surveyed prior to any construction. Use a plane to see if there was any ruts in the roads. Make sure they didn't heavy loads. To move one of the cranes took 8 semi-loads, and then each turbine took 30 to 35 loads of cement, and plus there was 85 to 90 ton of rebar in each foundation. And then the wiring and the heavy machines doing the access roads and everything. And our town roads seem to hold up real good. So they started construction in 2008, and it went along real good. They had a little problem with one turbine that damaged to one of the blades. They had to wait a couple weeks to get that, or otherwise they would have been online on March 1st of 2009.
John, are we ready to advance to slide 4?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great.
With the project here in New York State, our Wyoming County Industrial Development Agency received a one-time payment of $210 million, or $2.1 million, I'm sorry. This is 1% of the total cost of the project. The project cost $210 million to build here in Sheldon. There are 38 landowners that site the 75 turbines, and they run anywhere from 1 to 6 turbines to the landowner. We have 2 landowners that have 6 turbines. Have total lease payments to the landowner, most of over $600,000 per year. Non-participating landowners, they got paid if they were near the 1,200-foot setback. There was, I think, 8 or 10 landowners are participant in that. There was a lease agreement for the landowners that had power lines going across their property. They got a one-time payment settlement for the first year. The wind company also, through SHPA, had to do some work on a historical building. The town owned a Queen Anne's two-room schoolhouse that we acquired back in the mid-'70s, a historical building. They renovated that for us, new windows, new heating system, new floors, new bathroom, fixed up the wall and a handicap ramp at a cost of about $95,000. Also, we have a town park. They blacktopped a walking path in the park, a basketball court, and that was all paid for from the wind project. Also through SHPA, this is State Historical Preservation Group. The wind company had to do something there. We had an old pioneer cemetery that the town maintains, had a stone wall around it. Wall had deteriorated and fell down, knocked down in many places. They took the wall completely down and rebuilt it. Stone wall way around the cemetery. We have another cemetery that had a fence around it. It was cut stone posts with rods through it and they've rebuilt that and leveled off that cemetery and storing it. Payment in lieu of taxes is, we have a kind of a unique situation here in Wyoming County. We have two other wind projects. We decided that instead of splitting it all with the schools and the county, that we would do a host agreement up front, which each town negotiated with their individual wind firm. We get 80% of the money up front as a host agreement. The other 20% is divided through the payout. County, the school, and the town share as what their tax rate would have been at the time. And we have two school districts in our town. They combined get about $105,000 in tax or payment to the schools. Our county treasurer gets about $50,000, and the town gets, this year we will be getting $37,000. When we negotiated our host agreement, it's a 2% increase every year, and it could go as high as 3.5% depending on the consumer price index.
John, if we could move on to the mitigation efforts, we're running a little short on time.
Okay.
Thank you.
The setbacks, we changed that from 750 feet to 1,200 foot. The wind company offered to do that voluntarily. We took advantage of it. There was windmills that was going to be problematic, so they were removed from the plan. That was 11. One turbine, we had to move it, have a public hearing on, and we moved it 300 feet back from a homeowner that wouldn't negotiate or sign off on it. There's been some shadow flicker from the rotation of the blades on. The developer has installed either blinds or drapes for the homeowners. TV reception. The developers, there's roughly 40 to 50 households that interfered with TV reception. They installed dish satellite reception for them. They pay for the basic service, and if the landowner or property owner wants additional services, they have to pay for that themselves. When we started negotiating with a wind developer, or in our law, we had a $1 million decommissioning bond had to be posted, and that's in effect for 20 years what the contract's for. and a $1 million road agreement or bond placed for the road agreement in case they did damage to our roads. They also set up a hotline if they had complaints, went right directly to the Chicago office, and available 24 hours a day. If there wasn't anyone there, you left a message and they returned a call within 24 hours. The first year they received 12 to 15 calls. They caused anyways arranged sound and flicker complaints of people looking for jobs and interested in hosting or having turbines set on their property. You can go to the next slide now.
Got it.
The process took 6 years. It was considerably longer than I expected at the time. I didn't think it would take that long, but it did. Engineering firm, spent quite a bit of time finding an engineering firm and had some experience in wind development. I don't think we would have changed anything much in that process. We have a good law, in fact, and it's many other towns or locations now have used our law. The wind project turned out, better than I expected it would. It's been a great, economic boost to our town and county. It's helped considerably. I guess, at the time we got we were the highest compensated per megawatt of any host community in New York State. Now there's been a couple more that's getting equal to we, or one is trying to get more. They haven't settled yet. If they're going to be able to pull that off. I just looked at the figures here. I've reduced the town taxes. Got our first check in 2008. We had no town taxes for 2009. Saved the taxpayers in the town of Sheldon here a little better than $3.5 million in taxes through 2012. The landowners have taken in about $640,000 a year, and that's been a real boost, especially when the price of milk had dropped down to, $14, $15 a hundred. It was costing more to produce it than what the farmers were getting for 100 pounds of milk. And there was kept them going too during that. Milk has now gone back up to $21, $22 a hundred. So the economy is starting to turn around on, for the egg. Yeah. And I guess that's all I've got. Just that I think it's been a great thing that's happened to the town, and apparently the majority of the landowners feel the same way, because I've been elected town supervisor, or served the longest of any former town supervisor since the town was founded in 1908. So it's like, that's one thing that's probably helped me to stay in office. For that, I'm going to sign off.
Thank you very much, John. Very interesting experience. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions to be posed to you at the end. So I guess we will now turn over to Nils Bolgen. Nils is Program Director at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And he focuses there on wind generation. In his role, he oversees the Mass Clean Energy Center's grant and loan offerings designed to support the development of wind energy in Massachusetts. He has over 25 years of experience with government-sponsored energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, and he's going to take us on a tour through some experiences with mitigation steps taken by a number of the wind project sponsors that he's worked with over the years. Nils, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Bob. We'll start off with a brief description of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We are a quasi-public state agency. We have a board of directors appointed by the governor. Our sole mission is to accelerate the successful clean energy development and implementation in Massachusetts. And while doing this, to create high-quality jobs and provide long-term economic growth in the state. We have 4 major program areas that are shown on this slide here. They span the value chain for clean energy, from sort of ideas in the laboratory through the installation of renewable energy generating facilities. I work in the renewable energy generation division, and we have substantial experience with wind project development that we've gleaned over many years now to our wind energy support programs. And so today I want to just provide a brief survey of some real-life examples of steps that have been taken by developers and sort of requested by communities in the wind project siting process, and in some cases look at mitigation steps that were taken at the operational stage of a project. What do we hope to learn from this? First of all, I hope we can illustrate the fluid nature of wind turbine siting. There can be a good bit of give and take back and forth between the developer and the community, as you've probably seen from previous presentations. We want to highlight the importance of doing pre-construction analysis and engaging the community as early as possible in the project development stage. And we also want to provide some examples of mitigation steps that were taken after projects began construction. I think we'll try to highlight some of the challenges that projects face in dealing with that after they've already financed and built their installation. So let's start with just a look at how we at the Mass Clean Energy Center break down the wind project development process. It's a little bit artificial and structured because that helps us with our program structures. In real life, the development process is a little more fluid than these discrete steps here. But we start with the earliest stage site assessment and feasibility study. That's just planning and seeing what will work, and then doing more detailed studies, and then finally you get into your permitting process, and if successful there, you end up on to procurement of the turbines and construction. As you go through these early stages, what we see is the project gets refined over time. The number, size, and location of wind turbines may change. This is the area where you really want to focus your engagement with the community, because this is where you can do your mitigating as part of your planning. And from a developer perspective, you can do your ongoing analysis of the trade-offs that you're making. Well, if I have too few turbines, maybe my economies of scale have gotten so bad that I have to take some other approach with the project. But those types of decisions are relatively cheap and easy to make in the planning stage. Whereas if you wait until the operation stage and and at that point public acceptance becomes a feedback scenario, then if you have to make operational mitigation there, you'll incur costs that probably were unanticipated, and that can affect the sort of the overall financial structure of the project. So let's first take a look at some examples of mitigation steps taken in the planning stage, because they're the most important. The most fundamental aspects of a wind project: how many wind turbines, where will they be located, how visible will they be, how close will they be to me. Those are things that can be varied at this stage. The obvious mitigation techniques are reduce the number of turbines, change their location to increase separation distances, and then importantly, what the developer would do is update and refine the acoustic and the shadow flicker studies, for example, to be able to then report back to the community how the project changes will effect and hopefully reduce impacts on the community. And these are the results: reduce the acoustic impacts, reduce the amount of shadow flicker, generally increase the level of comfort among neighbors, and all that feeds into improving the likelihood that you'll get your permits, which is what the planning stage is all about. So for our first example of a project that employed modifications of the number and layout of wind turbines, we want to look at the New Generation Wind project in Bolgen, Massachusetts. It is not operational. It has not been approved yet. It's in southeastern Mass, just at the very beginning of Cape Cod. The project developer in March of this year submitted its initial application to the Cape Cod Commission, which is a fairly unique organization that has jurisdiction over a project like this. They proposed 7 wind turbines, most of them 2.5 megawatts. One was a little smaller. They were proposed to be on 100-meter towers. But as New Generation Wind got into the review process with the Cape Cod Commission, and they began to get more focused feedback from the community, they, even before getting very far along in the process, they made some modifications. These were also driven by some concerns expressed by NSTAR Electric. They wanted some of the wind turbines that were proposed to be moved further away from some transmission lines. The initial thinking had been that the maximum blade tip height, that would be sufficient separation from the lines. But at some point in the process, the utility indicated that they wanted 1.5 times the maximum height for some added comfort. So this resulted in July of this year in a revision to the project. They reduced the number of turbines to 4. They still kept the same turbine sizes, but they did increase the minimum separation from residences from around 800 feet in a couple cases to at least 1,300 feet in all cases. And so why did they do this? First of all, they wanted, from the feedback they got, they wanted to reduce visibility from the Cape Cod Canal area, a historic area and scenic area, increase separation from one residential area, and comply with the electric utilities requirements, as I mentioned. Here's an illustration on the left of the initial layout. You can see the red circles indicate the 7 turbine locations. And then on the right, you can see where several of the turbines were eliminated from the proposal. The outcome, though, of this sort of project change and concession by the developer is it's unclear, and it appears to be a little bit tenuous at best. The project is still under review by the Cape Cod Commission, but the subcommittee that's been reviewing the project has made its recommendation to the full commission, and it is that the project not be approved. We'll I guess learn the ultimate disposition when the full commission meets in January, so we'll have to stay tuned for that. Now, let's take a look at another project in the same general area, southeastern Massachusetts. This is a project sited on some cranberry bogs. It's called, the developer is Beaufort Wind. The project name is sometimes called Bog Wind because of its location. Beaufort Wind filed its application to the Wareham Zoning Board of Appeals back in September of 2010. They proposed a total of 8 turbines, 5 on these 2 bogs called Barker and Parker Mills. Large turbines, sort of maybe the current standard for today, but 2.5 megawatts, 100-meter towers. They did propose at least 1,400-foot separation from residents. But when the project was proposed, there was sort of a great backlash in the community. Efforts were launched to modify the local bylaw, and the process dragged out. But during that, the developer took really a drastic step of reducing the number of turbines from 8 to 2, and they increased the separation from residences to at least 1,700 feet. They selected that distance because that was consistent with a threshold established by the Cape Cod Commission beyond which a project was presumed to be acceptable. So this was a very conservative approach taken by the developer. And again, took these steps in response to vigorous opposition on the basis of acoustics, shadow flicker, and appeared property values. Concerns about decreases in property values. Here are a couple of
Bob, just a point of clarification. You mentioned 1,700 feet, and the slide said 2,700. Could you just clarify there?
Yeah, excuse me. 2,700 feet is the revised distance, and you can see that here. At the north area of these bogs, the red circles indicate the 3 original turbine locations. The green circle is the revised location, and that's increased separation from this residential area to the west. And it was the same type of scenario over here on the image showing the southern portion of these bogs. Before actually getting to this next slide, the ultimate disposition, this project had a long delay because of the bylaw change efforts that took place in the town. It seems to have recently been resolved, and so now I expect that this project will be, the Zoning Board of Appeals will take it up again and rule on these 2 turbine locations at least. Now let's switch gears and look at some mitigation steps that were taken to avoid impacts on air operations. So now it's not neighbors and residences, but an airport. The project was evaluated and proposed by the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. They have a very large wastewater treatment plant on Deer Island, which is out in Boston Harbor. The original concept was multiple wind turbines in the sort of 1.8 megawatt range. They'd be up to 400 feet high at their maximum tip height. The FAA response was that, no, I'm sorry, it's given the proximity to Logan International Airport, they wanted to limit the height to manage obstruction clearance. They wanted to also limit the number of turbines because they were concerned about interference with the airport surveillance radar. On the right here is an example of one of the determinations of presumed hazard that the FAA will send to a project like this. You get one of these for each proposed wind turbine location. So negotiations ensued. The FAA did ultimately accept, beginning with 2 wind turbines. They said they would allow 2 turbines to be installed and then evaluate their impact on the airport radar. They had to limit the height to 190 feet above ground level, though. Well, the MWRA, as they're called, they got innovative. They installed 2 600-kilowatt turbines on what are relatively short towers for a turbine of that size, approximately 35-meter towers. They could get away with that because you can see in the illustration here, the open water area is to the south, the west, and even the northwest of this site. And that's where the prevailing winds come. So interference from these egg-shaped structures in the back on the left-hand side, which are digesters for sewage sludge, you wouldn't get so much interference from those. These 2 turbines were installed and operational in late 2009. It really only took several months for the FAA to decide that they were comfortable with the radar issues, and they allowed a third turbine to be installed. That went in last year, and the FAA indicates that they're now ready to approve a fourth wind turbine. That's all well and good for the Mass Water Resources Authority, but they are a little frustrated because it would have been more economical for them to install multiple turbines at the same time for crane mobilization costs, for example. Now, we want to switch gears a little bit and look at a couple examples of mitigation of impacts that was taken after wind turbine was in operation. The first one is Hyannis Country Gardens, a plant nursery and gardening center in Hyannis, Mass, out on Cape Cod. We'll just go to the illustration here. The arrow shows the location of the turbine. If you can see it close enough, this aerial shot was taken after the turbine was installed. It's a relatively small turbine, 100 kilowatts on a 47-meter tower. So the shadow flicker effects don't extend too far, but there was at least one complaint after the turbine went operational, and the owner elected, or maybe was forced, I'm not sure, to mitigate the impact by curtailing operation at the early morning hours when this flicker was a problem. It didn't have too great a financial impact, but you could imagine that if a larger wind turbine was installed at this location, the flicker impacts would be much greater, and the amount of mitigation might become sort of untenable. Now let's take a look at a larger wind turbine that had encountered some more complex issues. This is an aerial view of the wastewater treatment plant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. The town installed a 1.65 megawatt wind turbine at this site, shown by the thumbtack and indicated by the arrow. The wind turbine provides energy to the municipal wastewater treatment plant. The yellow circle indicates a 2,000-foot radius from the project. You can see there are a couple areas that have residences within 2,000 feet, the closest of which are about 1,300 feet. This project encountered vigorous concerns about noise expressed by multiple neighbors not long after it became operational. The municipality, the town of Falmouth, to their credit, they did respond very well in terms of engaging with the neighbors, undertaking some additional acoustic monitoring and analysis. Some of that had back and forth with the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. Based on this, they implemented some temporary measures. Interestingly, they initially elected to curtail operation around the cut-in wind speed. The analysis seemed to indicate that the turbine would be more audible at those lower wind speeds. In fact, that didn't really make much difference according to the abutters. Instead, they said the turbine was most audible and most annoying to them at high wind speeds. So the town implemented some curtailment at high wind speeds, and that did seem to provide some reduction in the noise. But as you can imagine, the high wind speeds are when you generate most of your electricity, so the economic impact of a long-term curtailment at those speeds might be difficult for the town to manage. This is a work in progress. There are additional evaluations going on by consulting firms looking at what the cost of removal and relocation of the turbines might be, additional operational curtailment, and even exploring some sound mitigation at homes, soundproofing, vibration proofing, things like that. The Mass DEP is doing some additional monitoring. at the site, and currently, actually just recently, the town Board of Selectmen has voted to curtail operation to allow the test run of a second turbine that has also been installed at the site. So just before we move to Fox Island, with Falmouth, all this additional analysis will be feeding into a action that would probably be voted on at town meeting this coming spring in Falmouth. And for the last project, let's look at the Fox Islands Wind Project up in Vinyl Haven, Maine. This is a 3 wind turbine community-owned project that became operational in 2009. They got this project has a lot of support, but some strenuous concerns have been expressed by multiple neighbors about the noise. Interestingly, they're not the neighbors that are closest to the project. Some are as far as 2,600 feet away. The Fox Island Cooperative has taken an aggressive stance in responding to these concerns also. They've implemented operation in low noise mode with this type of turbine. That is an option. You can slow the rotor down. You pay a penalty on the electrical output, but you do get a reduction in the noise output. There's also some work in progress. You saw in Charles Newcomb's slides the serrated edges added to the trailing edge of some wind turbine blades. That technology is being beta tested by General Electric on the wind turbines at Fox Island. There's been a lot of activity in this area on this project, and the Fox Island Cooperative hopes to publish all these reports early next year. So that would be good to see how that all shakes out. And really, just for some conclusions and observations, do the rigorous analysis. Do it early. It can help you avoid unexpected impacts. Focus on the planning stage for your mitigation wherever possible. Engage the public early and often, and even after you get through the permitting process, let them know before you start construction, because that may have been part of the issue in Falmouth. Steps taken to mitigate impacts will certainly affect project economics if they're too drastic. You have to take that in mind. And finally, the impacts and the mitigation steps, especially with sound and visual, it's in the eyes or ears of the beholder, and in some cases there's no right answer for everyone, so that's a challenge. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nils. Sue, if you could put back up my my slides, and so we have a couple more things to do really quickly before we go to Q&A. First of all, just a reminder that the webinar materials, the PowerPoints, as well as transcript and the questions that will be asked by participants will all be posted by December 21st on the New England Wind Forum website. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last funded webinar for NEWIP. The original funding is no longer available. Participant feedback so far has strongly supported the need for what NEWIP has attempted to do, a need for a continued forum that's focusing on fact-based information and exchange in a fair and civil manner. For such an effort to be successful, its motivation, its concept, its funding, its oversight, its planning needs to come from neutral sources, sources that are perceived as neutral. So going forward, there are efforts underway to establish funding for some form of continued effort through New England Wind Forum or NEWIP or some related projects. And we very much would welcome all participants' input on the next steps. what content should we be focusing on? Are there topics that need further exploration and where there's a need for more information? Is the focus right? And importantly, what about potential funding mechanisms? What funding mechanisms would be available and not perceived as changing the objectivity? NUWEEP has not taken funding from any wind developers and manufacturers. We felt that's important for that perception, but it also makes it challenging in this environment where there's little government funding available to figure out how to provide the information necessary. We will be distributing a post-webinar survey afterwards, and we encourage you to participate and provide us with feedback. As far as keeping in touch, the conference proceedings from the NUWEEP conference earlier in June are all online on the New England Wind Wind Forum site, and it will continue to be a source of information for the project and for additional information going forward. And if you wish to receive announcements or offer suggestions, please sign up at the link shown here, and do consider signing up for the Wind Powering America newsletter, which is available. You can sign up at the link shown at the bottom. So at this point, we're going to turn over the floor to the questions. Again, we have 24 questions queued up. Please go to the Q&A and enter them. Remember to click Ask after you type it so that it does show up, and we can ask it. If you've started typing, we can see that you've done that, but we can't see your question. So again, please introduce yourself or just say your name, your organization, where you're from when you're posing a written question, and I will start reading them through. I have a couple of questions that were posed, and one or two that I'd like to ask throughout. If we get fairly far into this and that we haven't teed up, I may slide a couple of those in. So I'm going to go to the Q&A, and the first is from Glenn, and had a question about air rights. Has New England addressed this? For example, if a turbine base is on one owner's land, what are the rights of the adjacent landowner when the blades are over the second landowner's land? And maybe related to this, maybe offset requirements so that that doesn't occur. Do any of the panelists have any experience or response to that?
Charles, I would suggest that with a 700-foot setback or more, when you've got a rotor that's 300 feet across, and that means a radius of 150, it would be really hard for that blade that's 150 feet to reach 700 feet to the next landowner's point. I guess that's assuming that it's 700 feet to the land and not to the house. But it's unusual for anyone to put a turbine that's less than 1.1 times the tip height from either a property boundary or a structure that doesn't belong to them. And if that's the case, then that's less than the blade length. So I would suggest that that's probably not going to happen.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Richard Slawinski from the town of Sheldon, New York, resident there. And this is an individual who has been seriously negatively impacted by the wind turbines that Supervisor Knab was talking about. We were told by Mr. Knab that there was no mitigation or mediation available in our town, and to contact the wind company directly, which has proven to be futile. What we'd like to know is if Mr. Knab has decided to change the no help for homeowners policy in the town, and we'll be assisting homeowners like us who may have to abandon our homes due to negative impacts. We'd be happy to provide sound study results proving that the noise violates the town wind energy conversion system law and other documents to any interested parties. So we have an aggrieved abutter, and Mr. Knab, do you have some response to that?
I've talked to this individual and told him that he has to provide sound information by a certified technician and certify that it's over 50 decibels, and then the town will act on it. At this point, they have not provided us with any information. I thought the town should pay for the technician to come in and do the sound testing, and we said no, that was up to the landowner. Where it stands at the present time.
Okay, thank you very much. The next slide here, will the slides be available to us after the presentation? Yes, they will be posted at the New England Wind Forum by the 21st of December. And is there research data on noise complaints depending on manufacturer and model of turbine? So do they, is there a difference perhaps between the noise produced by manufacturer and turbine model? Is there reason to believe that noise complaints are higher with certain machines? And also, is it possible for you to tell the audience that the person asking this question, who's Tom Stanton at the National Regulatory Research Institute, is working on a white paper about wind siting and zoning for all 50 states. So I think I just did that. And he invites participants to email him and ask for a copy of their state summary. They'll need help checking to make sure they're getting the summaries right. There'll be a list of people who want to see the finished paper and so forth. So Mr. Stanton can be reached at tstanton@nrri.org, and then information will also show up on the Q&A, which the questions that were posed will all be listed on the website. So back to the initial question to the panelists, is there research information that talks about noise or provides any information on noise that might be different for different manufacturers and turbines?
This is Charles again. So I would indicate that I'm not aware of a comparative study, but if you look at the specifications for the turbines, they're all landing at about 103 sound power level equivalent, 103 decibels. And that's, a theoretical point in space, an emanator that's, what, a half a meter in radius or something like that. So, so they all have almost identical sound emission levels, and that's being driven by the market. So today, they're pretty uniform. In the past, oh boy, yeah, they were very different. We had turbines that were nearly silent, and even in the small wind world, still today, you have turbines, depending on the regulation mode, certain residential turbines that are stall regulated and very quiet with electrical braking versus a furling turbine that kind of turns its head out of the wind. Really different sound signatures and sound power levels. So that's true for small wind, but not so much for big wind. The exception to that is when you have somebody who has, like Fox Island, where they've actually got the blade treatments that we talked about installed, and those will be quieter than the comparative 1.5 without them.
Okay. Thank you. Any other response from panelists, or shall I go to the next one?
Go to the next one.
Okay. The next question is from Peter in Massachusetts, and he asked, how do all the mitigation payments affect the overall cost on the ratepayer base and therefore the overall economic viability of wind investments as opposed to other energy alternatives like natural gas, coal, oil, or solar? Nils, do you want to try to take that one?
I guess mitigation payments for a large project that has maybe 10 up to 30 or 40 wind turbines, a project like that can probably bear a greater level of, in absolute dollars, of mitigation payments without adversely affecting the project economics. It becomes much more challenging, though, when you have a smaller project with just 1 or 2 wind turbines.
Okay. The next question is from Callie in Boston, and Callie asked, do trailing edge serrations produce a 3 decibel reduction in sound power or source levels, or in measured sound pressure levels some distance from the source? So the question is that a 3 decibel reduction that Charles talked about at the source or at the receptor? Charles?
Typically, those sorts of mitigation elements are described in terms of a sound power level, so they're from a theoretical source. Not, I mean, you can't really decouple the two, but yeah, it's typically as it were an emanator. So if it's 103, it goes down to 100, and that's where you start from a theoretical basis. Okay,
great. The next question is from Kathy. She asks, for mitigating the effects on avian species, how far from important birdie areas the last stop in the fall migration of many nocturnal songbirds and marine species should turbines be placed?
This is Charles. I don't think that can be answered because I think it's too site-specific. You know, it all depends on what's happening, what are the driving forces on their migration route. So they may be hooking around a lake, and so they might be pulled closer to the corner of the lake than further around the corner of the lake. So and then they could get blown off course by wind. So who knows? That's a good question for a biologist, but not a technologist. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks for trying. Okay. The next is from Deb in Wisconsin, who asked, how do you address concerns that the approach of getting everyone on board through neighbor community payments is just trying to buy people off? Some people, for example, have expressed that the noise will always be a problem and that money won't make the problem go away. You seem to contradict this with your name across the crowded room example, but I'm sure this addresses the feeling that wind noise is different from other types of noise. So, Charles, I think that is directed at you.
Yeah, I think there is a big difference between a noise that is kind of persistent and a noise that comes and goes, that's for sure. But I think, you know, a highway is a nice example of a noise that comes and goes. Sometimes it's noisier than other times. And if it was against all of your best wishes to have that highway placed there and it ended up there, it would always drive you crazy. And so there, you know, that's where I say it's attitudinal to a degree. That yes, sometimes you can take a decibel meter and say, yeah, you're over the line. Sorry, you have to mitigate that. But other times, it's astonishing how perceptive people can be. So. In cases where people are really concerned about the sound emission from a turbine that's 2,700 feet away in a neighborhood where you just would have to work so hard to hear it, it's really hard to. That's a difficult thing for a developer to hear. Is like, really, that's driving you crazy, and you can ignore all the dogs and cats and cars and helicopters and all the other things around you. But I agree with you. If I really listen for it, I can hear it. Well, that's what they do. They're annoyed by it. They're unhappy with it, and they can never turn that annoyance off. And so you're not going to get everybody. You're not going to turn everybody around, and there's always going to be one or two people that, no matter what, are going to be unhappy. It's not Shangri-La, and that's just unfortunate. But it's also part of sharing a planet. The anecdote for me was a situation where we had 2,500 folks in a nearby county, and 7 people didn't want in that county, and it didn't happen. The project didn't happen, and it would have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue to that county, and that didn't happen. Well, those were a handful of people that prevented the county from coming out of this extreme poverty that it was in. So it's not really buying them off. It's sharing the benefits of a new form of generation that provides lots of benefit, not just clean power, but economic benefits as well. And there's a lot of other impacts and resources and activities that humans do that don't have that kind of an attribute, and I think it's really important to see it in that light.
Thank you, Charles. Just because this is an important topic that I've heard come up frequently, this different perception of neighbor payments or butter payments to compensate people for impacts versus the perception of buying them off. I just wanted to see whether Nils or John, you had any comments you wanted to offer on that topic as well.
No, not really. This is John. I have.
Okay.
I thought Charles said it very well.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next one here. So this is from Hillel, from AKRF. Are there examples of large arrays of small-scale turbines, such as building integrated machines? I'm thinking of a situation where putting in tall towers may not be feasible, but existing structures at sufficient height are available. Any thoughts on that as I guess, as a mitigation technique?
Well, I thought the example of Deer Island was a great example. I wouldn't call those small building integrated turbines, but that's an example of sometimes you need to literally get under a radar, and more smaller turbines is a solution. If they're getting at the point of, well, let's put in 101 kilowatts or 1,001 kilowatts or 1,010 kilowatt turbines, no, folks generally don't do that because there's a pretty steep curve that describes the cost per kilowatt installed, and small turbines can come in at, $4,000 or $5,000 a kilowatt, and big turbines are coming in far less than that. So it just wouldn't work economically to do it that way.
Okay. We have a related question, I think, from Dick Adams on the Middletown, Rhode Island Planning Board, and Dick asks, can someone talk about small wind under about 60 foot and its impacts? What are the impact variables that should be considered, and what are the specific limits?
I feel like I'm taking a lot of these. Is that okay?
If they seem to be aimed at you so far. So.
Okay. Yeah, towns have a lot of towns have small turbine zoning ordinances, and they speak to setbacks just like they do for big turbines. They speak to sound levels just like they do for big turbines, and more and more there's something that hasn't come up at all in this call, so I feel a little bit bad bringing it out of context, but it's the notion of certifying small turbines and sort of the UL sticker equivalent to know that it's a safe piece of equipment that'll be productive and will hit the performance goals that it's supposed to hit. And to that end, there's a group called the Small Wind Certification Council that looks after small turbines and certifies them. It's a new body that was formed in the last 5 or 6 years and has the first turbines that have now been certified. And so some ordinances are beginning to look to that, and certainly state incentive groups are looking at making sure the turbines are certified so that nobody's putting up home-built turbines where they shouldn't be put up. Not to say you can't put up a home-built on a farm where you're not going to impact anyone but yourself, but it's really trying to ensure the safety of the neighbors. So yes, there certainly are similar ordinances for small as there is for large.
Okay. The next question is from Mark Maynard of Urban Power in Massachusetts, and he asked, has anyone tried to couple these large turbines with smaller vertical axis turbines that are quiet, bird and bat friendly, and work well in lower wind speeds and can be located lower to the ground to increase power produced by the wind farms? So I guess he's talking about perhaps a blended installation that might have larger turbines further from property lines and smaller vertical axis turbines closer to abutters. Is anybody familiar with efforts along those lines?
Sorry, go ahead.
I have no experience at all with that. So.
Well, as a former agriculturalist, I have to admit I like the image of the permaculture for wind power. It's a beautiful image. The fact is that the best winds are up high. So when people are trying to make utility power for sale in a competitive utility market where you're competing against coal and natural gas and other forms of very inexpensive depreciated power. No, you typically want to get your wind turbine as high as you possibly can, and that's the larger rotors on the taller towers. The place for small towers and small turbines is when you're offsetting retail rate power. So they make a lot of sense because retail rate can be 3 times or 2 times anyway what wholesale power is, and 3 times what the busbar price is for utility scale. So no, nobody that I know of. There has been some interesting work in Southern California where they're doing an array of vertical axis machines, but I think those results are still forthcoming.
Okay.
Bob, I have one thought on that.
Please.
This is Nils. Although it's not a vertical axis wind turbine, I didn't show a picture of the third wind turbine installed at the Deer Island wastewater treatment plant. That turbine is a demonstration model of a new design. It's horizontal axis, but it has a shroud mechanism up around the rotor, and the purpose of the shroud is to concentrate the airflow into the rotor swept area. The notion there is that you get higher wind speeds across your rotor, and therefore you have a higher energy production for a given sort of general ambient wind speed. It's quite an interesting design. It may be more friendly to birds because the large shroud is certainly much more visible, and it allows conceivably a smaller wind turbine to produce as much energy as something that might be a bit or substantially larger.
Great. The next question is from Annette Smith from Vermont, and she raised the question of Vermont has approved 2 wind turbine projects with 459-foot tall wind turbines, one with 155-foot setbacks from property lines, one with 196-foot setbacks from property lines. Is this safe? And what is the speaker's opinions of these setbacks from property lines, especially since they're on top of mountains where there will be icing and ice throw? And here, actually, this brings up a very important distinction. We've talked and heard about setbacks. One of the key questions with setbacks is, are the setbacks measured from the turbine to a property line, or are they measured to a residence or to a receptor? And so why don't I put that first to Nils, and then anybody else who would like to respond?
Well, in a rural or forest setting, it does become, I think, a different equation than in a community type setting. Certainly, you want to be concerned about distances to an occupied building or residence or an area of common activity. Really, the only thought I have is I'm familiar with one project, one ridgetop project that has a snowmobile trail that goes through the project area, and I believe that they have to work out a system for closing that trail or providing an alternate path at times when there may be icing on the blades. But to me, it all boils down to what type of activity is there within that vicinity. Perhaps less, where the property line lies.
Okay. John or Charles, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I like the perspective that it's about risk and it's about activity. When we were installing turbines at schools, there was often the concerns, well, what about when the kids are playing underneath the turbines or having a picnic under the turbines? Are we worried about ice? And when we pointed out that, do you kids typically have picnics in that field when the trees are full of ice? And the answer is, oh, yeah, good point. So a lot of times it's connecting the dots and understanding that, they may not be coincident events. That it's really about risk and what's the risk to property damage from falling ice. If you're over a Mercedes-Benz parking lot, that's one thing, and if you're over woods where you have ice fall from the trees themselves, that's another thing.
Okay, so if these are mountains that are used for snowmobiling was a good example, or hunting or hiking, those are part of the uses that might be factored into the equation.
Absolutely. Very site-specific and very use-specific.
Okay, great. The next question is from Jay Silva Energy in Massachusetts, and he asks, how has the noise and vibrations been for the neighbors? I guess why don't we start with John, and that seems to be the most specific project to react to.
As far as vibration, you don't. It doesn't matter if you're standing right next to the turbines or, 1,200 foot away from them. You don't feel any vibration. Noise, it also depends a lot on, if you're downwind from the turbine or upwind, it cuts down the velocity of the noise considerably. And like was said before, I know myself, we have 3 that's, a third of a mile from our house, and yes, you can hear them at times. You have to listen to hear them, but, it's not a real offensive noise. And I don't, we haven't had, other than 1 or 2 people's, or once it's complained about noise.
Okay.
No, we don't have a lot of noise.
Nils, since you were talking about some specific projects, any reaction to that question?
Just to reiterate, I think that it's very subjective. I don't recall if I mentioned on the Fox Islands project up in Maine. It's an old, established working community. Lobster fishing and things like that. I used to do quarrying there. For the folks, many of the folks who can hear the turbine but are very concerned about their electric rates, they're comfortable and it doesn't bother them. There are others who maybe have moved to the island, and it's more of a refuge type setting for them, where peace and quiet is probably much more highly valued. They will experience the sound differently and react to it probably more negatively. It's just highly subjective.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question for John Knab. This is from Deborah from Massachusetts. So John, do you know if there have been other calls to the hotline since the first year of operation? And if so, what's been the nature of those calls?
Yes. There's two individuals that call quite frequently the last couple of years. The same complaint, the noise, that seems like maybe greed and jealousy has a big part of it, that they didn't get any money for being within 1,200 foot or nearer than 1,200 foot. The one individual, the turbine was moved, so it was not, he would not sign off, so the turbine was moved to make it more than 1,200 foot from his house. So. And the other end is over 1,200 foot, and his house is almost directly under a power line, 440 power line that he caused regular complaint about noise.
Okay.
Either one has failed to get a sound test study done. So.
Thank you. The next is from Seth Steinman at People's Power and Light in Rhode Island, and he asked, how do you recommend responding to blatant misinformation and lies by opponents of wind turbines? In one instance, PolitiFact, the Pulitzer Prize-winning organization, rated their statement a pants-on-fire lie. And while responding to that, I guess I would ask that how would you apply that if misinformation was put forth by project proponents as well? Anybody want to take that one first?
I'll give it a try.
Okay, Nils, you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
I tried to get across the point that community engagement in the planning stage is very important. One thing that project developers and municipalities or host communities might consider is engaging professional neutrals, facilitators, if you will, in the process. Some neutral third party that can help sift through the information, and I don't know if they would categorize it as pants on fire or highly credible or something in between, but just some neutral third party to help out in the process.
Thank you. Charles, did you have something you want to contribute to that?
It was one of those situations where I couldn't do any better than that. That is exactly the right thing to do, is find somebody else who will evaluate it for you and actually say, this is truthful, this is credible, this is scientific based, and this is misinformation or malinformation. And really call a spade, because when you're looking at a public, a siting or an ordinance, or you're looking at some sort of a project that requires public approval, really that's not a place where you should be introducing false information into the equation. It really should be based on fact, and I think there's just something abhorrent about trying to fool people.
This is John. We had quite a bit of that during the siting project here, and our engineering firm, proved most of it wrong. Just seems that people get information, they can put anything they want on the internet, and everybody else believes it. It's gospel or something. But no, I know here in another project, neighbor to us, is unbelievable. The remarks that come out of people, and they print in magazines and papers and stuff that just not true.
But Bob, to your point earlier, it's just as wrong if people completely downplay the impacts. There are impacts, but they're manageable, and so it really needs to be based on balanced information.
Thank you. The next question is from Dan Webb in Falmouth, Mass., and he asks, for Falmouth, are there other mitigation options such as serrated blades or reduced power operation during high winds being studied? I guess that would be one for Nils.
Not yet, but one of the things I didn't mention is that well, the town has their consulting team looking at these mitigation options, retrofits to homes and things like that. The Mass Clean Energy Center is also providing some consulting resources to the town, specifically to the Board of Selectmen that are trying to help deal with the issues there. We're providing a sort of a wind technology consultant and an acoustic consultant. And I think when we get all these teams together, I think that there'll be an opportunity for some freewheeling brainstorming to consider what types of additional options should be looked at, and maybe that one comes about.
Okay, great. I've got one that I've been saving up here that I'm just going to slide in. We've heard speakers talk about a number of mitigation techniques that really apply broadly to the community, their mitigation benefits to the community. And isn't that less than compelling to the abutters who might be disproportionately impacted? And so what can be done about those that are disproportionately impacted? Perhaps Charles start and go around the table.
Yeah, we discussed this briefly. That's the notion of the neighbor payment as opposed to some payment in lieu of taxes. The payment in lieu of taxes would be for the community itself to acknowledge that there's perhaps a visual impact, but not from a shadow flicker perspective or anything else, but just that it changes the landscape and that might be worth something. And the neighbor payment is more about you've got somebody who's closer to the project who may be affected, perhaps not above a health threshold, but above an annoyance threshold, and it's worth acknowledging that. And if you have it in the mitigation budget, quote unquote, to do that, and the project still works, then that might be worth something worth considering. So we've definitely seen that, and again, in the context of our earlier comments, it's not a buy-off, and that's not what it is. It's really an acknowledgement that there is an impact, and yes, let's make it right with you. Sometimes it's just easier than other things.
Okay.
And this is John. In our case, people that had problems with the flicker, they installed either Venetian blinds or drapes on their windows that was affected. At pretty much the landowner's discretion what they wanted. And as far as TV reception, it was they installed dishes and pay for the yearly basic cost. Every January you submit a bill to them for your first bill, and they reimburse you with a check for the full year's service. So those are the problems. And as far as sound, the individuals they've bought pine trees and planted pine trees for some individuals. Other individuals that give them the money, they buy the pine trees, and which never happened. So this is things you learn. I guess they should have planted the trees.
And is the idea with the pine trees that they absorb and mitigate the sound?
Yes.
Block the sound?
Yes.
Nils, do you have anything on this one?
I think that pretty much covers it. Other than neighbor payments, I've seen examples where they've been proposed, and the payment amount is sort of proportional to distance from the project.
Great. Let's see. The next question is one I think has been addressed already, so I'm going to move to the following one, which is from Greg in Massachusetts. Can you comment on low-frequency sound wave impacts and efforts to mitigate? Anybody want to take that first?
That would sort of fall into the category where it's really hard to quantify. We've had a hard time, our industry has had a very hard time finding evidence that that's a real health issue. I think you can find instances where some people may have been annoyed, but those people who may be annoyed from the infrasound from a wind turbine would also be annoyed from the infrasound from the highway, for example. The world is awash with low-frequency noise from sources all around us, and it travels great distances. And it's very difficult to suggest that a project is going to tip that individual over the threshold. You can point at all that one project, and I think that's where the biggest concern or biggest difficulty has been, is actually saying, yeah, that project did it. So, no, given that it hasn't been proven yet as a real issue, credible real issue that has been signed on by more than a couple of doctors. You can always find a couple of doctors to say something. It hasn't been a focus of anyone's real attention other than to say, hey, this isn't a real issue.
Okay. Anybody else want to, Nils, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add that in Massachusetts we have the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Public Health have convened an expert scientific panel to review acoustic issues associated with wind turbines, and their report is expected before too long. I don't know for sure how much that gets into the low frequency side of the spectrum, but it'll be interesting to see before too long.
I know they took a lot of public comments on that, and I'm sure I remember seeing some comments on low frequency being posed, so hopefully that's something they address in their scope.
Probably hard to ignore.
Okay, so the next question is from Jim, who asks, how active has Massachusetts Windwise been in opposition to various projects in the pipeline? I guess I'd target that at Nils, but at the same time, I'm not sure we really want to be pointing anybody out here. Is there anything you'd want to say to that, Nils?
We see a lot of the press reports and speak with our grantees or our loan recipients about how they're doing in their permitting processes, and yeah, there's a wide range of folks that participate, provide comments. The Massachusetts Windwise name crops up fairly frequently. There are others also.
Thank you. The next question is from a Chris Capsambelis, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who asked, how is the 10-rotor diameter restrictions instituted by the Cape Cod Commission going to affect future installations on Cape Cod? Nils, I think you're probably best suited to address that.
Okay. The way I understand it, the 10-rotor diameter rule or guideline is, that's the threshold within which the project needs to be subjected to detailed review of acoustic or shadow flicker studies and things like that. If the project was proposed and it was beyond 10 rotor diameters from any residence, then presumptively that project would not have unacceptable acoustic or shadow flicker impacts. I'm not sure actually on Cape Cod whether there are any locations where that might occur, but it's not a prohibition against projects closer than that. It's just a threshold for more rigorous analysis and permitting review. Thank you.
So I know we've gone beyond our time. We have 11 questions left up on the Q&A board. I do want to just ask the speakers if they're willing to stick around and go through a few more. We still have 129 listeners on, so clearly people are engaged in listening to the Q&A. Is anybody okay with trying to get through another 10 more or so? Sure. And then we'll cut it off there.
Yes.
Thank you. We all appreciate that. Next is from Susan in Massachusetts. What has been done about understanding health issues, suggestions on how to calm fears of health problems and wind turbine syndrome? I don't know, I think perhaps Nils, your comment there on the Massachusetts DEP and Department of Health study is perhaps one answer to that. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to offer?
Well, the American Wind Energy Association has weighed in on that, but you know, that's one of those things where you say, well, where's the money coming from? So despite their best efforts to find independent folks, they're always going to be swimming up stream with answering those kinds of questions. So I think that's a good space for us to step in, and we've definitely, the Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has weighed in to a degree, and said, well, let's look at the research. And it's the wind turbine syndrome. Again, it's a bit like epilepsy from wind turbine shadows. Sure, there's a chance, but how real is that chance, and what can we do about that? There is a special report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation. There was an intergovernmental panel from the working group a few years back that we can make public at the conclusion of the webinar.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, we have two questions from Kathy Karch from Salem Safe in Massachusetts. One is, how closely did the energy production and money generation estimates for these various projects align with actual production numbers when the turbines went online? Did any projects under or overperform early estimations from companies, and why? Nils, you want to talk about that one, since this is a Massachusetts question, and then Charles, you can, Charles and John, I appreciate both weighing in.
Sure. We do keep track of the energy production from the projects that receive funding support from the Clean Energy Center. And we, I think not surprisingly, we see a range of outcomes in terms of actual production compared to what might have been predicted in the planning studies. And we've been at this for a long while, so one of the things we do to try to get a better alignment between the two is we've instituted various methodologies for the pre-construction analysis on how to measure the wind resource and estimate the long-term wind resource and things like that. All designed to try to get better upfront estimates.
So as an industry, we've had some disappointing news recently in which we found that systemically, yes, sometimes we have discovered that estimates can be a little bit higher than reality, and that has nothing to do with people inflating what they think they're going to get out of a wind project because they're trying to get better financing or something like that. It's being pointed to room for improvement in our modeling techniques, because getting the exact nuances of how surface roughness has an interplay with the atmospheric conditions above there's still room for improvement there. So we're beginning to make that bias go away, but it's going to be there, unfortunately, because we can't be perfect. And now that we know that it's an issue, and it's in the order of less than 10%, but more than 5%, is my understanding from an industry perspective. But now that we know it's there, we can make immediate corrections to the bias and then figure out where do these errors come from. There's a great resource assessment workshop next week in Seattle in which this is the Thursday conversation. It's what's going on and how do we fix that. But there's also, there's so many factors in being able to predict it. And, we just went through the longest negative North Atlantic Oscillation Index since mid-1960s or so. So that can be.
What does that mean, Charles?
Sorry?
What does that mean?
Oh, it's the La Nina, El Nino kind of equivalent in the North Atlantic, and that's going to drive the direction the wind goes and the strength of the wind in the eastern seaboard. And so those kinds of things are coming into play where we have these long cycles, and we may be riding through, and that's an example of a long cycle that was 30 years, 40 years in the making. So we'll see if our bias goes away in the next couple of years. But being dead on with a model, that's really hard to do when it's as complex as the systems that we're trying to model.
I think I'll weigh in on this one a little bit. I was involved in a project recently taking a look at historic performance of some wind projects, and one thing that I learned from the literature was that prior to about 2009, the industry as a whole seemed to, for a number of different reasons combined, had a roughly 10% on average shortfall bias in estimation. The industry has largely corrected for that, so that while there may be variation of expectations, it doesn't. Most of that bias has gone away or been corrected for in current projections going forward. it's important that 10% was average. Some projects were as works with averages, some projects have been far worse than that 10% off, and some have been better.
You know, the one thing I would add is that we've gotten a lot better at forecasting short term. So our ability to integrate wind with the grid in a smooth and predictable fashion has gotten so much better than our error in that 10%.
The next question is from Alex, who asks, is it possible to connect a battery to the turbines and use the battery at the power outage? Is this real practice operating like this? Just for a matter of time, that's really not an on-target thing in terms of mitigating public acceptance issues. So in the interest of time, why don't we skip over that one? The next one is from John, who has a two-part question. What is the scale for evaluating wind site production, and what is the likelihood of a commercial developer proposing a project on a marginal wind site?
What do you think they mean by scale? Like spatial, or is this time, or? Well, let's answer the second one, see if that gets us to the first one. There's a lot of room in the industry right now to develop good projects. So there's some interesting artifacts out there, like, well, how much more is this going to cost you? Well, if you ask developers how much are you willing to pay for this, they all have a number in mind that it's less than 10, 15% or something like that. They're willing to pay on a premium for something else, and then they won't pay it anymore. Why? Because they go elsewhere. So I think right now it's kind of a buyer's market in terms of developers, that they can go and develop projects elsewhere, so they tend not to develop marginal projects now. As we see development proceed in the future, and the easy and the high margin sites are long gone, then we'll start to see movement into marginal. If anybody is developing a marginal site, they have other reasons for doing it. So I would suggest, certain projects like community projects that are in less than stellar wind resources, that's because there's an educational value, or there's something else. I know projects where there's a 20-year payback, but the community is just fine with it because they are really on board with the notion that wind energy is part of their future.
The next question is Chris from Massachusetts, and he asked, does the Fox Island project have a design goal for noise reduction for the blade retrofit? How is the success of the retrofit going to be evaluated from a noise standpoint? So are any of the speakers familiar with that?
This is Nils. That's a level of detail I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, this is Charles. I would agree that that's a project-specific detail that I'm unaware of.
Yeah, this is John. It's the same for me, too. I'm not aware of the project at all.
Okay. 4 more questions. Paul from Massachusetts asked, for mitigation payments, are there established rules of thumb or best practices for determining distance from turbine eligibility? In other words, how do you establish a practical radius? Good question.
This is John. On ours, if it was less than 1,200 foot from the house to a turbine, you got a payment. It was a fixed 1-year payment or one-time payment, and I'm not sure what the exact amount was, but it was, just a one-time payment. As ours, like the shadow flicker or anything like that, that was just a one-type deal also. So.
Okay. Others?
I would suggest that it's very location dependent. So, so if you're in an area where it's really quiet, right, and there's no background noise, then perhaps that 1,200 foot number might stretch. If you're in a marine environment where you have a lot of surf noise, or you're near a highway or something else, or other sources of noise, background noise, then that 1,200 foot number might be retracted back. So it's really on a location by location, a pixel by pixel basis that most of those decisions would be made on.
And wouldn't that also be a function of how big the project, how tall the turbines are as well?
Exactly right.
Nils, anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. Next one is from Jonathan, who asked, earlier Peter asked a question about effects on ratepayers. There was a comment about mitigation payments, but the question was not answered. What are some examples of kilowatt costs over the life of the contract? how do these rates compare with present costs for other renewables as well as natural gas? So that sounds like it's a question about wind energy economics in general as opposed to the cost of mitigation. But is there anything there anybody would like to respond to? That sounds like it's a question for a different webinar.
Well, Bob, maybe I can recover a little bit from if I missed the question in the first try. I guess if the mitigation is done at the planning stage, the developer is going to factor the costs of the mitigation into the overall project cost, and which in turn informs what the facility needs to sell its power for. If it's a wholesale or commercial type project looking for a long-term agreement with someone to buy their power, it might have a small effect on that. And whoever's buying the power, that would parlay into a slight impact on the customers. If it was a net metering type project, where in that case the cost to the electric ratepayer in Massachusetts is probably established by the existing electric rate structure. So in a situation like that, the level of mitigation payments or reduction in the scale economies of the project, that would just translate into an impact on the financial return for the sponsor of the project.
So, Bob, another thing is that next week we've got a webinar on wind power economics, past, present, future trends. So that might also be a great opportunity for that.
And how would our listeners find out more about that?
If they go to Wind Powering America, there's a green bar across the top, and they can go to the WIND program, so ERE WIND program, Wind Powering America, information, resources, and then they'll get to the webinar podcasts, and in the upcoming webinar gray box on the top right, it's a link to the wind power economics.
Great, thank you. All right, the next question, and the second to last one, is asked by Brian Clark in Massachusetts, who asked, are the noise specifications for a 100 kilowatt size turbine the same as the large ones, 103 dBA, stated earlier? I'm not sure where the 103 dBA was. That the sound pressure at the source?
Yeah, that was a number, right, that if you look at the Siemens spec sheets and the GE spec sheets, et cetera, you'll see that 102, 103 number that comes up. And the Northern is a little bit quieter. If I remember, I think it's 100 dBA, so it's half as loud, but it's also quite a bit shorter. So, in fact, it still needs to be sited not quite 700 feet away, but it needs to be sited not immediately adjacent to abutters who aren't supporting the project ahead of time.
All right, thank you. And I guess the last question is from Peter in Tiverton, Rhode Island, who asks, should a site have a benchmark of the background noise level before the turbines are installed on a site?
I know, this is John, I know in our project here, the developer did testing for sound before they ever started to do any construction at all, to get us what the background noise is. And then after the turbines was up and running, another test was run, and it was all below the 50 decibels at the property lines is where they took the readings. But no, they did do a background noise test before the turbines was installed, and I did, I think, 6 different locations in our project for sound. Some near main roads, some right out in the field, half, 3/4 of a mile from a road, and took the readings for that and compared it with after the turbines was up. That's all I have.
Bob, in Massachusetts, that's a very important step for many projects, because our statewide noise regulations limit increases in noise caused by some device, in this case a wind turbine, over the ambient sound levels. And ambient sound levels are very location specific. If you're in a quiet rural area, it's going to be a lot lower than in a suburban or an urban type location. So doing a pre-construction or pre-permitting ambient study and then doing the modeling of the wind turbines proposed, layering that on top of the ambient noise study is very important. Just almost as an aside, we require that in many cases for wind project feasibility studies that we fund, and we're on the verge also of releasing a standardized methodology for doing those studies, because we've seen a bit of a range of methodologies used, and we want to get them all standardized. So that's something that we have going programmatically.
All right. Well, we've gone through our questions, and again, I'd like to express thanks to our speakers for their participation today, as well as their patience and willingness to stay on for extended time through all of the questions and answers. We even still have 100 attendees on, so clearly there's a lot of interest in and thirst for information and interest in getting answers and learning from others' experience. So we thank you very much for contributing to that dialogue. We thank the listeners and participants for listening through and asking a wide range of very good questions. And hopefully the answers have been helpful. And again, I'll thank everybody for participating in the NUI project. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to continue offering these webinars in the future, and I encourage everybody to follow up and respond to the post-webinar survey, which will be sent around shortly. And again, thank you to the folks at NREL for operating and hosting the webinar.
Thank you, Bob.
That's it. Take care.
Yep, take care.
Thank you, Bob.